Good Friday evening to all of you. Thanks for logging in. Thanks for being with us. I am Denise Deming, and I am the co-chair of today's discussion. It's a very serious discussion for Friday afternoon, but here we are. It's a national conversation, and maybe we need to just change our behaviors and not patronize the bars as much as we used to, and start to focus on Trinidad and Tobago and where we could be in the future. I'm your co-chair, and let me introduce the other person who's chairing you. The issue this evening is being chaired by two women, Rebecca Gookool-Bosland. Rebecca, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our conversation. We are looking forward to a very engaging evening. As Denise said, I am Rebecca Gookool, and I am sharing the co-chairing responsibilities with her this evening. Looking forward to a really fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And please, we want some engagement in the discussion, in the conversation, but we also would like you to put some of your comments and your questions, put it in the chat so that everybody else can see it and we can all respond to your chats. Make sure that if you are not speaking, that you keep your mic muted, because we don't want to disturb the presentations. If you decide to make a contribution, could you try to be as concise as possible? Try to ensure that you are considering what is on the table and we don't bring too many extraneous points or notes into our conversation this evening. We have three speakers this evening, and our first speaker will be Mariano Brown, and he will be followed by Dr. Tewari, and the final speaker will be Dr. Roger Hossain, the person whose idea this was, and he continues to ensure that we have serious conversation. Let me hand over to Rebecca to introduce Mr. Brown.
Again, good afternoon, everyone. Let me introduce you to a distinguished gentleman who has had a very long and successful career in commercial and investment banking, having managed several commercial and investment banks across the region. He is a former Minister of Trade and Industry, and a former minister in the Ministry of Finance. He is currently the CEO of the Arthur Lockjack Graduate School of Business. So we're looking forward to his discussion tonight. Mr. Brown, please go ahead and share your screen, and let's get started.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much. Just give me a second here. There it is, share screen. Good. So since I'm starting off, I'll keep it simple. In terms of where we are, where we're heading, where do we want to be, where do we want to, what we have to do to get there, and what are the things that we need to pay attention to from the point of view of policy as well as an implementation perspective. Since my time is about 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to make it simple and just deal with what you consider to be the broad or big picture issues. First of all, the Article IV, and one has to put it in the context of Trinidad and Tobago. The IMF is often portrayed as a rogue, that is somehow or the other going to be a plague, would be visited upon the country anytime that you speak to them or they recommend anything. We are a member of the IMF, and in accordance with our Articles of Ascension, the Article IV Consultation, the Article 4 of that Ascension allows for part of the IMF's regular monitoring of economies and also the provision of policy-making advice in accordance with the overall IMF's responsibility and its guiding objectives, which is to ensure that countries are kept on the right track and don't become outliers and create what we consider to be financial or economic instability. Now, having said that, you would say perhaps that advice should be given to the countries which perhaps have a greater role, or if you want, share or form a greater percentage of the world GDP and are therefore likely to have a bigger impact. We've been a member since 1962. And when we joined as part of the Africa group. Dr. Williams would have chosen that group probably because the fact that there were newly independent nations which were coming onto the scene. If you were to join any other group, and we have to, when we think of the IMF as one organization, as a single organization, in fact, it's broken down into a number of constituent groups. Each group has about 10 or there are 194 countries. Each group has about an average of about 10 or 12 in each group. Our group, I think, has 10. We are not in the same group as some of the other members of CARICOM. I think only Haiti and Guyana form part of our group. But we are in part of the group which includes or is led by Brazil. Each country has votes in accordance with its percentage share of the its contribution to the IMF. Our votes is approximately 3,600. Countries which are bigger than us, for example, the United States has approximately 300 and something thousand votes. So when it comes to voting, of course, we are outweighted by virtue of our size, or they outweigh us by virtue of their size. The Minister of Finance is a governor of the IMF in the same way that the Minister of Planning is a governor of the IDB. So by bottom line, that they form part of the Board of Governors, which makes policy. And the alternative governor from Trinidad and Tobago is the governor of the central bank. Now we've had, when we were part of the Africa group, we did in fact have 2 deputy governors who acted as executive directors. Director of the IMF. That would have been Leonard Williams, and a recent recipient of the Shakonia Gold Medal of Merit, Jerry Hospitalis. Why is that important? Well, it's important because when we start talking about policy and policy being made, in particular, the 1986 recommendations and or policy which was agreed by or with the IMF by the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the presumption is that this policy was visited on Trinidad and Tobago by the IMF. Well, it wasn't. That policy was in fact crafted by a Trinidadian who was at the time an executive director of the fund. I wouldn't lead you as to which of the 2 names, but suffice it to say that in a meeting with him last week, I went over 2 of the original documents, which he would have prepared in his own right as recommendations to the government of Trinidad and Tobago, given his involvement in the IMF at the time. So that was a background to, given these circumstances, what sort of policy recommendations would be needed and how would we negotiate a position with the fund. So the crafting of that particular set of policy responses, right, in public domain is reputed to be something which is imposed upon us by the IMF, not understanding that in fact those policy prescriptions in fact came from Trinidadians, came from the government of Trinidad and Tobago itself. Right? And that's something that we take into consideration. One of the fundamental issues, of course, is always looking at where we are, what we need to address. Now, where are we? Well, we know we've been in a recession. If you have a recession consistently, it's about 2 quarters of decline. So when you go past that and you have a couple of years of decline, you really are in depression. We've been in depression, where we've had continuous decline in economic activity, continuous decline in terms of our economic performance on an ongoing basis. That has also coincided with some difficulties in our energy sector, where we've been declining in terms of oil producing country for quite some time. Our maximum production was somewhere between 220 to 240,000 barrels of oil in the 70s and 80s. And since then, we've declined to approximately coming down to 60,000 with a couple of new finds. We probably will go back about 80. That's the projection, that we'll go back to about 80. But that has to be compared with Venezuela as its smallest, at just approximately 800,000 barrels, and Venezuela is its largest with 4 million barrels of oil a day, and which is also said to have the largest reserves of oil in this part of the world. And to be compared as well with North America, which at the moment is the leading producer of fossil fuel energy, is now outstripped Saudi Arabia. We've seen recently has the capacity to affect prices and supply by releasing stocks from its reserves. Having said that, the bottom line that oil still is important to us on a relative and absolute basis. We produce approximately 60,000 barrels and we use approximately 25,000 barrels. So we export 60,000 barrels and we import 25,000 barrels worth of terms of refined product. Now, that means that we could more or less hold our own on the basis of a like for like, and we probably lose some value because we are exporting unfinished product, whilst we're importing finished product. And the reality is in between, we have transportation costs. And truth be told, transportation costs of energy has gone up significantly as a result of what has taken place in the Middle East, especially for mid-range tankers. And we would fall in the mid-range tanker facility and lower-end tanker facility. So price of freight has gone up. So those are one of the things that we have to live with. But the underlying problem is that our economy has been a little lopsided. A little is putting it mildly. We've depended on the energy sector for approximately 40% of GDP, and sometimes 50% of government revenue and 85%, up to 85% of our foreign exchange. And that is what makes us, in a sense, lopsided, because the other sectors, by definition, are small. And it is clear if we just simply look at what is taking place in the European Union and the European situation at the moment. Anytime you depend on one particular item, then you are at risk if something goes wrong with that item. And I speak, of course, with respect to the Russia's significant contribution to the European Union energy needs, which averages about 41%. When you look at the charts from the International Energy Association, in some instances, it's as high as 83 in the case of Finland, somewhere in the case of 58 in the case of Poland, and in terms of Germany, which is the powerhouse of the European Union, it accounts for approximately more than 55% at times in terms of its natural gas requirements and approximately 40% of its oil requirements. And the bottom line is, if you have any one sector that is proving to be such a significant player in your sector, then by definition, in the case of the dictum from Mark Twain, if you have all your eggs in one basket, then you better pay attention what takes place in the basket. Well, that's our case. And the reality, we've gone through at least 3 periods of depression as a result of changes in our energy position. And so in one particular case, the first case that we ran into difficulty would have been when the energy majors Shell, BP, exited the market, then followed by Texaco. We were lucky to have found another energy partner who found significant deposits elsewhere. But that lasted until we had ran into our other problem, which is 1986 with depression. Then took a long time for us to come out of us. What rescued us? 1999, literally we turned on the taps for LNG, and that basically led to a 10-year growth spurt, which ended, we'd say, around 2009, and then another small recession, and then continued by another spurt, which took place in 2011 and to 2014. The bottom line being that ended in 2014. We relied on other sort of injections, which kept the economy going for approximately 1 year, largely the dividends from energy coming through our major, if you want, way of tapping into the energy source in a national gas company, which essentially kept the country afloat for 1 year longer, right? And then in 2016, we really ran into the problem. So we are at risk, right, for dependence on the energy sector. From a business perspective, that's pretty straightforward. If you're at risk and you depend significantly on one particular area, then we need to talk about diversification. The issue, of course, is that we're small, 1.4 million people in a world of 7 billion. To enjoy the standard of living we enjoy, then by definition, it means that we have to work very hard at other things to put us on a different footing. So we will run into difficulties as long as we depend on the energy sector. So how do we move? How do we diversify? What has been the position? Well, this is the IMF data mapper, which is in October last year, with some projections moving forward. And the difference being the real GDP growth is in terms of red and the inflation rate on the other side. Well, there were periods, very narrow periods, between 2000 and 2008 thereabouts, their peak periods where we would have done a little better than we did with regard to the inflation rate. So real GDP would have outgrown the inflation rate. And you'd want that at any one stage of the game to happen. In fact, you'd want that consistently for real growth to take place. So what we're looking at really is that adjusting for inflation, our history in terms of real GDP growth has tended to lag behind the rate of growth of inflation. So that's another improbable that we also have to treat with as an underlying trend. There are causes and reasons for that, of course, attended and attached to the fact that we've been an energy sector economy. So sometimes how we deal with it. And one of the issues that the IMF talks about is pro-cyclicality. I treated that as a separate issue. So what are the problems? Well, contractual negotiations with the energy sector had us in a bit of a wavelength for a period of time, somewhere between 2016 and 2018 until we got that right. And then the prices were high, and we found ourselves that some of the petrochemical plants were closed. Then there were supply challenges, which has continued literally from 2013. Initially, in the first case, we thought it was because of maintenance. Then the real issue became an underlying trend where supply had started to decline, drop. There were some changes. We put some fiscal incentives in position, and for a very short period of time, we managed to push the graph back up, but never back up all the way. And since then, we've been in persistent decline. There has been, as I understand it from the statements which have been made between November and now, there's been some improvement. We haven't seen the numbers. None of the numbers are published, so we don't know. But the talk has it, so we presume that the talk is reasonably strong, that we've moved from 2.4 billion cubic feet a day, which is to be compared with our high of 4.2, 47% decline, and we move back to 2.8. Right, so those supply challenges are longer-term supply issues which remain, and the result of that, of course, is declining foreign exchange reserves, and at the top, pricing on international market prices, where we are market price taker. We don't make the prices. And since we've been in recession or depression for a long period of time, what we had is growing public debt to my right. And then we have other issues in terms of local cost of production, the impact of local environment, the whole question of ease of doing business, and the other challenges we face to make sure that a competitive place on the world stage. So what did the IMF report say? Well, there are about 4 positive things. And I want to say the IMF report, in its critical summary, is a very dense document. Some people think that it's said in diplomatic language. The answer is yes, it's said in diplomatic language. Why is it said in diplomatic language? Well, if you want to influence people, you don't tell them they're doing a bad job. You try to tell them, well, there's room for improvement. We say it to them in the kind of language which is much more palatable than to have somebody foreign come and tell you, well, look, you're doing shit. Excuse me, bottom line. So that's not the way the language is written. So therefore, one has to undergo and to, in a sense, parse the report to determine exactly what they're telling you. And the first thing that they say, these are the couple of things that they say. This is dispersed through the document, but we could distill it to 4 positives. One, that the position with respect to the current spending profile was correct to mitigate the effect of the pandemic. And quite frankly, the IMF has done this and said this to every country that has had to run into and take increases national debt and take extra measures. And in fact, if you want, move away from fiscal prudence or fiscal responsibility and basically break whatever rules there may be in terms of deficit financing. And they have generally supported that. And their argument has been life first. You have to save lives and basically stabilize the country before anything can happen. And quite frankly, I think everybody agrees with that. So there's no question about that. The second point is that they've made is that given the total economic circumstances, the position of the monetary authorities, the central bank, which has a sort of modest interest rate policy, lower interest rates, not generally too expansive, but it has been expansive. When you compare it to policies which have been around the world, monetary policy in literally every major country and every major region has been in expansionary mode since 2008, the recession. And if there's anything else a lesson that we could draw in the current circumstances, is the last recession that the world faced which largely affected OECD, Western OECD countries, much more than affected the East, was about the interdependence of financial markets and the failure of one sector in one country, which had ramifications across the entire Western financial sector, which led to a recession which lasted for between 4 and 5 years. We only started coming out of that recession in terms of 2012, somewhere thereabouts. The second thing that it talked about, the second positive, that there was some improvement in reform and that we had managed to avoid the Financial Action Task Force grey list. In other words, that we had become compliant. And that's a word that we're going to hear a lot about, compliance. Now, I think that there are a whole other set of questions offhand, and we need to ask with regard to this whole question of the Financial Action Task Force, and how do we fall in and treat with some of those changes that are coming about. And those changes do not merely exist in the financial sector, but they exist across a wide range of fiscal and legislative measures which have a dual-sided effect. That's another story. It's not the subject for tonight's discussion, but that's also something that we also need to take a position on. And the fourth positive thing they said is about our commitment. Now, our commitment here is stated because, quite frankly, in policy terms, we really haven't done very much to adjust our position where emissions are concerned. So those are the four positives. What were the recommendations? What did they say? Well, those recommendations are contained in 3 very dense paragraphs on page 2. Right? And there are approximately 16 recommendations, as I counted them. There probably are more, and those of you who paid more attention to the report could probably add to them. First of all, they talk about the need for a growth-friendly and inclusive fiscal consolidation over the medium term. Now, that in itself has all different sorts of implications. But bottom line is that when we're talking about fiscal and monetary policy, the adjustment process in Caribbean territories, monetary policy is a very blunt tool. And from where I sit as a former banker, I really don't pay too much attention to monetary policy. I understand what the central bank wants to do, but quite frankly, it takes a very long time for monetary policy to work. I think in real terms, the most significant aspects that we need to pay attention to are fiscal adjustments. What we do with taxes, how we adjust taxes, and basically how do we craft them in relation to make those policy and fiscal interventions work together. And they talk about a growth-friendly and inclusive fiscal consolidation. Now, those terms hide a wealth of meaning. Growth-friendly. Well, what do businesses want? They want stability in the taxation environment, and really and truly speaking, we like to pay as little possible as tax as possible. So what does that mean? It really means that the message is don't increase taxes too much. And probably if you have done it, don't do it any further. We've also seen in other Caribbean territories that have run into some problems. The attempt to balance our books on the fiscal side has always led to a set of exit. Right? Businesses have reshored, nearshored, they've done all different kinds of things and also take advantage of fairly beneficial tax provisions in other territories. So suffice it to say, growth-friendly really means don't increase the level of taxation. Right? It's a nice way of putting it. Inclusive fiscal consolidation over the medium term. Inclusive, well, all-encompassing. Fiscal consolidation, well, you have to manage your expenditure. And you have to manage your expenditure within a particular framework. So you can't do it all in one go, but do it over the medium term. So that means somewhere between 3 to 7 years. What is the actual framework? Well, they're not saying you have to do it, but they're saying that you should do it. Right? Place public debt on a downward trajectory. Well, that's pretty straightforward. There are 2 ways to do that. One, you could increase GDP. So numerator, denominator, simple arithmetic process. If you keep one stable and increase the other one, then by definition, the percentage falls. Right? The trick is how do you get GDP to grow? That's a critical one. But in the meantime, if you can't get GDP to grow, concentrate on basically making debt a manageable proposition. Because if you don't make that manageable, it means that your degrees of freedom, your ability to undertake new tasks or new developments, or alternatively to explore alternative areas declines because you can't borrow. A well-designed medium-term fiscal framework with clear fiscal rules. Well, the English in that really says that you have to be disciplined. I think that's what the message is in that particular line. A well-designed medium-term fiscal framework means that it can't happen in 1 year. It can't happen in 2. You have to do it on a graduated basis. You have to have a plan of action, and you have to stick to it. So by definition, if that's what we do in accounting, that's what we do when we run a business. We measure the company on the ability to generate revenue. What do we measure revenue? As a percentage of sales, as a return on assets. So what you're looking for is a particular return. You want to know that the company is doing well and doing well progressively over time. And that rate of return is, if not constant, growing over time. Well, the reverse of that in terms of running a country is that the debt to GDP ratio is what you want to control. And you also want to control what we consider to be a fiscal deficit. In other words, don't keep spending more money than you earn. You didn't say that, but that's what they said. Multi-year fiscal discipline. That's repeating the advice in the third sentence. Multi-year fiscal discipline. It's not 1 year, it's several years. And regardless of who is in power, then you have to stick to those rules. That's what that says. Avoid pro-cyclicality. Well, we're seeing it. We're coming out of a situation where we're in a depression. We're likely to get a little bit more money. Right? Prices have gone up. We haven't done anything along those lines. The ammonia prices are approximately 8 times as large as they were in 2020. The price of ammonia has moved from approximately $205 a ton to something in the region about $1,600 a ton at this week's pricing. Why? Well, because Russia and Ukraine produce approximately 40% of the world's potash, which is used as a mixer for fertilizer. Oh, and we forgot about Russia also produces. Russia and Trinidad were at one time the 2 largest exporters of ammonia. Why is ammonia important? Why is potash important? Well, fertilizer, right, feeds the world. And if you don't have it, by definition, yields fall. And if we have rising populations across the world, then by definition, we need to grow more food. So prices have gone up and are likely to go up and to continue at that level. But we are not in control. As long as the events in Ukraine and Russia continue as they are, and as long as sanctions continue as they are going to be effects across all commodity markets. And we have been the beneficiary of those effects. So can we rely on them in the long term? The answer is probably not. So because anything that goes up comes back down. So the bottom line is what you're going to do with the surplus now. How are you going to use it? How are you going to use that to help trend off? And to trend you or to move you onto a different level of production to help diversify the economy, to get business to move into particularly in different areas. So pro-cyclicality, we don't go and spend more money because you have it in your hand. Mitigate risks. Well, how do you mitigate risk? There's a thing called the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. You want to have buffers. So by definition, put some money in the HSF, in addition to manage the energy sector a little better than you've been doing. Improve public spending efficiency. Well, the obverse of that is manage corruption. 2, manage money better. Make certain don't talk in terms of how much money that you have spent, talk in terms of what you have achieved. What have been your objectives and where are you in terms of your objectives? It's too easy to talk about how much money you spent. Right? What we need to talk about is results. Right? Reduce fiscal transfers to state-owned enterprises. Well, the subtext on that, of course, is that government should get out of the private sector. And if the private sector could do more, then the private sector should do more, right? Let them do it. You don't get into it. The reverse of that is like saying, if National Flour Mills only made $1 million, it probably could have made a lot more money. And don't use state enterprises to do what is called closet subsidies, right? Bottom line. We know that transfers and subsidies account for approximately 50% of the budget. And one of the critical aspects, I think about 25 to 30% of the transfers and subsidies is in fact due to transfers to state enterprises. Bottom line, if it can be done by the private sector without it being subsidized, then let the private sector do it. That's the argument. Then it also looked at the monetary sector, right? That monetary policy should remain data dependent. Well, that means roughly the policies should be informed by what is taking place, right? And if inflationary pressures materialize or capital outflows intensified or the recovery falter, then you have to change your monetary policy, right? Well, why would monetary policy be facilitate capital outflows? Well, if you lend money and somebody could find a way to fund it, money is a very fungible commodity. We could use it to borrow, basically, to buy foreign exchange. We don't want that to happen at all, right? And by definition, we want you to keep the lid or attempt to keep the lid on prices. So if you have to tighten up monetary policy, do so. Well, since everybody knows, including the IMF, well before this date, right, that inflation is on the way and inflation has started to rise. Well, that really is advice that says tighten your monetary policy. They stress the importance of modernizing foreign exchange and money markets infrastructure to reduce inefficiencies and imbalances to support the exchange rate arrangement. Well, that's a mouthful. What we're really saying, what they've already said, is that the current exchange rate mechanisms are not working. They're not market determined. And in fact, they're too subject to too much external influence. And the external influence, of course, is that you are attempting to manage the exchange rate, where everybody knows that the exchange rate is overvalued, right? And if you continue doing that, well, you're going to have some self-reinforcing policies which are going to reinforce all the negatives, and it's not going to work. So you have to find a way to make your policies coincident, contiguous, that they work together, that they are harmonized. That's in essence what they're saying. And elimination of exchange restrictions on current payments, and I forget what how did they put it again? Sorry, I'm not seeing the screen, so I forgot the exact word. Yes, on multiple currency practices in a planned manner. Well, one of the old tricks in banking is when everybody wants cash and they all come at the same time. To avoid a run, you have to make certain 10 people line up and everybody wants cash. You have to give them all the cash that they want, right? And the 11th one, you give him 2. Because by the time the 12th or the 13th one comes, well, they saw everybody walk away with the money, then they begin to have a little more confidence in you. And the point that they're making here is that the arrangements which are in place with regard to the foreign exchange aren't working. They don't build confidence. And by definition, when people don't have confidence in the system, what do? They hoard. It's like if we have a difficulty in terms of our supply chain arrangements, and you notice, for example, when you looked at the height of the pandemic and you looked at the shelves in Walmart and a couple of the other firms, you saw empty shelves. Well, insecurity, lack of confidence breeds its own demand. That's the point that is making, right? And as long as you have a system where you are going to be rationing, right, people are going to find ways to get around the rationing system. So the bottom line is make it available, make it rational, make it sensible. If you have to adjust the price and allow the exchange rate mechanism to work, to squeeze off additional demand, then let that happen too. Right? They didn't say that, by the way, but that's what they just said. Careful monitoring of financial conditions to detect any buildup of vulnerabilities. Well, that means look after the banks. Pay attention to banking profitability, how banks are lending, and check to see whether we have some delinquencies and bankruptcies taking place, in which case then we have to tighten up some of the regulations with regard to how banks lend. And that's to make certain that if banks don't run into trouble, when you have recessions, banks run into trouble. All right, if you had any doubt about it, just remember that one of the key things that happened in 2008 is a series of bankruptcies of financial institutions which continued and followed the line of the closeout in the home mortgage sector and collateralized mortgage obligations, right, which led to a huge bailout of financial institutions by the state. And what the IMF is saying, we don't want you to go and bail out any financial institutions, because when you do that, effectively, you are also using your fiscal revenues in ways in which do not help the economy to grow by bailing out bad institutions. For example, in 2022, the Bank of England still owns 47% of Royal Bank of Scotland, right? It still owns 47% of Royal Bank of Scotland. This is 14 years after they first intervened. They haven't got rid of it. And for those who don't remember, the interventions in terms of what we now call FCB didn't end until 2008, 2009, if I'm not mistaken. That would have mean it took approximately somewhere between 15 and 20 years to transfer NCB or to FCB to make FCB stand on its own feet. So the bottom line is banking intervention is expensive and it takes time to fix. And following from that, strengthening the bank regulatory and supervisory frameworks. But the two work together. You don't only have to look at the vulnerabilities, you have to pay attention to it. You have to follow through. And by the way, you have to have the power to change. When CLICO required intervention, which it fell under the central bank at the time, it required the Banking Act to be changed. Question, could we have anticipated those changes from before? The answer is yes, they were anticipated in 2003. What happened between 2003 and 2009? Nothing. So the bottom line is if you're going to look and recognize the signs, if you recognize the signs, then make certain you fix your regulatory environment so you don't reach to the stage that you have to intervene and you have to spend your own money. Make certain you fix your problems before they become problems. That's the bottom line. And on the other side, looking at the real economy, we need comprehensive structural reforms to promote the non-energy sector and boost potential growth. You can't depend on the energy sector all the time. Do something about the energy or the other sectors. Strengthen the economy's resilience to climate change. Well, you have to meet your external obligations. You need to be doing much more renewables. Renewables also help you to use more of your energy sources for other things, right? So fundamental issue, you have to adjust your economy to change, to meet some of the changes in the world, as well as to, because climate change is something that we all are part of. And if I'm committed towards maintaining global stability, then by definition, I also have to pay attention to how you deal with some of these other challenges which are coming. And data gaps. Well, you can't make decisions without data. And quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen of Trinidad and Tobago and government of Trinidad and Tobago, right? You need to do some work with regard to CSO. You've been talking about this for a long while. You have to stop talking and get things done. Now, those are the 16 items that I saw, right? They are contained in all the very dense paragraphs, 3 paragraphs on page 2 of the report. You don't have to go further than page 2. This is only from page 2, right? It's the meat of everything that comes. The rest is the desiderata. How did I arrive at these conclusions? What did these things say? Why did I say what I needed to say? That's the other 60 pages of the report. Well, not 60 pages. This is page 2. There's 84 pages of the report. So the other 80 pages then. The other 80 pages explain these 16 recommendations, right? And this is really what the IMF is, in other words, I may have said it a little differently to the IMF. The way they said it, perhaps is not as diplomatic language, but the bottom line is that there's some vulnerabilities that you need to pay attention to. If you need to talk about being stable and to be continuously stable for you to achieve some growth in the future, then you have to sort of stabilize the system in the real economy, in the financial sector, and by definition, how government manages its expenditure. That is what I consider to be the essence of the IMF's Article IV consultation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariano, for that. And I'm sure that that will stimulate a lot of discussion, the 16 points, as well as a number of the other things we've talked about. All right, we have 2 respondents, and our first respondent, Mariano, could you stop sharing your screen, please? And Dr. Tewari, could you put on your mic so that we can go straight to you? Dr.
All right, are you hearing me?
Okay, yes, we're hearing you. Yes, we are hearing you, Dr. Tewari.
Hi, Denise, you're muted.
My goodness. All right.
All right, okay.
So our next respondent is Dr. Tewari, who has been both a senator and a member of parliament. When someone tells you they've been a member of parliament, it means they've been able to pound the pavements and get people to vote for them. That's hard work. And apart from being a member of parliament and a senator, he's played a key role in education, where he's been the ex-director of the IOB. And that's where I recall Dr. Tewari, because that's when I did an MBA. That is now the Arthur Lockjack Global, and he's also chaired NEHIRST. In addition to all of that, Dr. Tewari has written 4 books, 2 on his own and 2 he has co-authored, and he has written several articles. So he's coming to you with a perspective that is very much on the ground, and also a perspective of someone who has been in the trenches. He's really worked hard as government. So Dr. Tewari, let's hear your response.
All right, thank you very much. I will shift a little bit in focus from where Mariano left off, and in outlining the 4 complementary responses to the government and the 16 challenges that they face. I think he did an excellent job in presenting what was the nature of the problem that we had to address. And the truth is that what the IMF has said is that Trinidad and Tobago is today faced with multiple challenges that have come together at once. They have bunched up. And that has happened simply because we have over time refused to deal with them. And I think that you can address those challenges in 3 items. One is the issue of income, expenditure, deficit, and living within your means. So that is one problem. The second one is the structure of production in the economy and the structure of exports because of that production system, which determine the level of dependency and the balance of trade and the balance of payments. And the third one involves and that balance of payments issue really affects your foreign exchange. And the third one is really your debt obligations and your ability to repay, given the fact that you are dealing now with a shrinking economy in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, the central problem in all of this, and the thing that is giving people anxiety and a certain amount of angst, is the issue of foreign exchange. And I think a complementary one is the issue of food worry, because people feel insecure about our ability to feed ourselves and to pay for what we need to eat as a society. And that, of course, affects the viability and sustainability of Trinidad and Tobago as a commercial and human enterprise. That is to say, the shortage of foreign exchange, which relates to the amount of food you can import, or the amount of things that you can import, or the amount of things that you can pay for. It affects the viability and sustainability of Trinidad and Tobago as a commercial and human enterprise. So as a consequence of this foreign exchange shortage, when you lump it with all the other problems, you are really dealing with loss of jobs, the difficulty of loss of jobs and income, the difficulty of recovery and growth. And you are also dealing with a problem, an immediate problem of the circulation of money inside your economy and the availability of money for things that you want to get outside of your national or local economy. Now, the issue is really, is it too late now that all these problems have bunched up at once? And can we really do any one thing and buy some time? Because so many things are interconnected, it is very difficult to do any one thing and buy some time. But any situation in which you find yourself in, you have to make choices, and you have to think things through, and you have to determine what sequence you're going to do things in. And I think that is where we now find ourselves, and that is the troublesome problem that we are dealing with, because we are not seeing the decision-making that allows us to see an integrated understanding of how you approach the solution to the dilemma that we are in. Now, what is the problem really with foreign exchange and the price of the TT dollar? And why is it undesirable to devalue now? Because there's a general feeling that our dollar is overpriced, yet there is also a general feeling that we cannot afford to devalue now. And the situation became stark today, for instance, when the price of fuel was raised. So that what it signals, this rise in the price of fuel, which it signals that everything that we use, that we consume, is going up. But it also indicates that that is happening at a time when salaries are stuck. They are not moving. Wages are stuck. They are not moving. So everything is going up. Prices are increasing for everything that you do and need, and the wages are remaining the same. And then basically what that signals is that an individual householder, an individual consumer, is losing control of their financial and economic lives. And everyone in the society has leverage in the society. If you buy and sell, if you produce, whatever you do in commercial activity. If you are government, you can raise the level at which you fix the cost of something. But everyone has leverage except the human being who is a worker on fixed income. And that is the dilemma that we are facing as we see the challenges that are taking place in the world. And as all of these things have bunched up together in Trinidad and Tobago's economy, and now exacerbated by COVID, the transformation that is taking place technologically because of COVID and because of the war and what it has done to almost every economy in the world because it's affectation of prices. So what is the minimum that we can do in Trinidad and Tobago? And what would the value of that be? And what are the likely negative consequences? I don't think that we can afford, given what the IMF has said and given what our reality is, and given our foreign exchange situation, and given that the structure of the economy is what it is, I don't think we can avoid dealing with the issue of food, hunger, and the inputs into the production system in Trinidad and Tobago. If you do not deal with that now, you are never going to deal with it. We've got to find a way of producing more of what we eat. We must make sure that our people do not go hungry, no matter their economic circumstances. And we must find a way of putting more local or at least neighborhood inputs into the production process. So the second thing we need to focus on is that means a certain amount of import substitution, but it also means export production. And therefore the diversification agenda and the investment to support export production and the acceleration of export production of those entities that do serve us now, especially in the manufacturing sector, that has to be accelerated at all costs. And again, I want to say, just as with food, hunger, and inputs into production, If we do not do that export production investment strategy now, we are never going to do it. And the third thing that I would say that we have to do is to call in the debtors together with the IMF, as well as the rating agencies, and have a frank conversation with them. Because unless you basically make peace with these institutions in addressing the issue of debt repayment, method of debt repayment, reliefs that can be given, etc., I don't believe that you are going to have the freedom and the wherewithal and the kind of economic and financial space that you need inside the country to do the things that you need to do, because you have to have the backing. I am not saying bring the IMF in, I'm saying bringing them into the picture. Bring the World Bank in, bring the IDB, bring the rating agencies into the picture, bring CAF into the picture, all of them with all the debt on the table. And you begin now to talk about what you might do to make a bad situation better. And the other issue is the oil and gas and renewables and our energy strategy for the future. I want to agree with the position of the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, who says that we will continue to have a significant dependence and value for natural gas in this country. So as bad as things are, we are not producing enough, the price is high, and so on. We need to do the natural gas. But that management of that transition to renewables and energy transformation has to begin to take place. And we need to have a medium and long-term plan for that, that makes sense to ordinary people and has targets and delivers results. This other thing that we need to do is that we need to understand, together with agriculture, the manufacturing, the export investment that we need, that is to say, investment to create exports, expand exports, is that we need to appreciate that the world is headed into automation, robotics, AI, the metaverse, and we need to understand that we need to do something about that. We have a robotics company in this country that is very successful. There are manufacturing enterprises in Trinidad and Tobago going into robotics. We say we are doing digitization and digitalization, but we need really to take the necessary steps to allow ourselves to benefit from that new economy that is going to take off in the more competitive countries of the world by connecting with it. And I feel that the way we can do it is to start with the robotics businesses that we already have in Trinidad and Tobago, which are doing well and which did well during COVID. And at the same time, pursue the digital transformation, but we must bring the graduate pool together. The pool of graduates, thousands of them, who are underemployed and who are not employed, and many of whom are now migrating. And we've got to bring that as a competitive base to attract the kind of investment that will allow us to be part of that world. Finally, we've got to address the issue of equity and equality. And I know I just have 7 minutes. I'll try and keep with that. I don't know if I've passed that yet. The only way you can address that equity and equality situation is basically if we have a situation in which we can feed all our people, in which we can house all our people decently, in which we can create the conditions for income for the people to pay for their food and their housing properly, And if we can achieve the digitalization and the export investment that will allow us to position ourselves at home in terms of security, a sense of security that would address the issue of equality and equity in a certain way in terms of possession of homes, possession of equity, possession of the means by which to feed yourself, and more than that, by also positioning the economy on the basis of our graduates into that world in which we can enter AI and metaverse and robotics, the automation world. So the problem is that when you put all of these things simultaneously, it's a lot to do. And we are not even addressing some of the issues that the IMF mentioned, like streamlining state enterprises and so on. But you can only do that if you have medium-term strategies and if you have a medium-term fiscal framework which they advise that you put into place. And that means that you have to manage what you are doing in such a way that you transform the structure of your expenditure pattern so that you put the expenditure that you need to put in a developmental agenda that can bring the recovery, the jobs, the income, and the growth. Now, I believe that it is this, I don't know if you would call it a misunderstanding or an underappreciation of the connectivities required among these things by the government that is causing our biggest problems, and therefore inaction by the government and isolated actions by the Minister of Finance and other people in the government. So when you raise the price of fuel today, it seems like one action without a framework. And unless you are able to talk to the population and explain to them what is the framework you are working with, how do you plan to work within that framework, doing specific things at specific times, how it will affect the population, how it will affect their ability to live, and how government is going to play a role in managing this, I don't think that we can get away with it. I think we are going to have upheaval in the country unless we are able to talk to people in that way and make them understand what are the requirements for sacrifices at different levels of the society. And I don't feel that we are anywhere near that. And that is why the IMF assessment, which I find to be very good, and I think that they have been very kind to the government and very diplomatic, to use Mariano's words. Nonetheless, the crisis is severe and the decisions that we have to take are very real and they must be taken now. They cannot be postponed anymore. They can't all be taken at once, but they can be sequenced, and people must understand what the sequencing means. And I believe on this count, the government is failing. I will stop at that point.
Dr. Tewari, thank you very much for your comments. And I'm sure that everyone on this conversation tonight can appreciate, coming from your extensive experience, the need to have a clear development and governance framework that we as an economy can adhere to. At this time, I want to hand us over to no less a person than Dr. Hussain. He is the coordinator of the Trade and Economic Development Unit, the host of our series tonight. He is no stranger to the public forum. So Dr. Hussain, go ahead and take it away. You need to unmute your mic, Dr. Hussain.
Am I on mute today?
Yep.
Yes.
Right. So, very good presentations from Dr. Tewari and
But-
Mariano Brown.
Dr. Hussain, you stopped sharing your screen.
I
huh?
know. Yeah,
Okay.
I will put it back up now. You know, this conversation comes at a point in time when two major things has seemingly, or two major announcements have been made. One, in the last, I believe it was this week, a few days ago, the Minister of Finance announced that the economy grew by 5.5 billion. And I think that is good news, and we should all celebrate that. And then today, we heard that fuel prices would increase. Super by $1, premium by $1, and diesel by, I think, 50 cents. Now, when I look at the IMF report, I generally go straight to table 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I look at the data. That's what is useful to me as an economist from the IMF report. I look at the data, and then I will look at their recommendations. But the data will tell me what I need to know anyway. I think it was Dr. Tewari or Mariano, one of them said that the IMF language has to be diplomatic. And I take that so that, but the data will say whatever it wants, because the data is in numbers, is not in text, and you have to interpret those numbers. And so if you really want to say something blunt about the Trinidad and Tobago economy or about another economy, you have to, you could say the numbers. And the numbers are there, and the numbers to me are a little worrying. And so this year, Rebecca, are you all seeing the screen? Right. This year is the forecasted growth performance of the Trinidad and Tobago economy by the IMF. And as you can see, we are expected in 2022 to have some strong energy sector growth, and in 2023 and 2024, but thereafter it tapers off. And the non-energy export sector growth doesn't really take off, you know. The non-energy export sector growth, having contracted in 2020 and in 2021, according to the IMF numbers, is expected to have moderate growth performance in the period 2023 to 2027. And the first thing I look for, and Denise, I won't be long, I will try to be as short as possible, because I know time is probably an issue, is the performance of the non-energy export sector. And they are there for you to see. The next thing I look at is the stock of reserves. And here, these are the IMF numbers. Again, they use a macroeconomic model. I suspect we have the same macroeconomic model, because I know Kartak did some work for the Ministry of Finance. And this shows that gross official reserves is going down, and the external debt is rising. And after 2022, at about 2023 there, you start to see them exchanging positions basically. So that's what the data says. And when I looked at the data in the IMF, this had me a little concerned. Now, of course, you could get an external shock like the Russia-Ukraine war, and that could increase prices and give you a blip upwards. But in the same vein, you could have a shock that drops prices very, very sharply and give you the opposite effect. So this is what we have here as per the IMF report that came out about a month ago, approximately.
Dr. Hussain, can you put it on presentation view, please?
When I tried to put it on presentation mode, okay, it came on now, okay. I tried earlier and it said no. Now this year is the distribution of employment in the economy. And in many spaces and places I talk about this data often, look at and I deliberately use 2019 to avoid any lockdown effects that could take place on the numbers. So you see that agriculture it's fell sharply. But what is of the biggest concern to me is manufacturing sector employment, which has the highest productivity between agriculture, manufacturing, services, and that fell considerably. And services employment, which has a lower productivity than manufacturing and petroleum, which expanded considerably when you compare 2019 with 2000. So from a labor market perspective, we have a change in the structure of the economy that has me concerned. And the IMF did mention that the labor force participation rate is a problem in the economy. So it's 809, I will try to be done by 812 pennies. Now this year points to the size of the labor force. Now something is going on here, folks. We have a contraction in the size of the labor force of the Trinidad and Tobago economy from 658,600 in about 2014 down to 603,000. So something is going on there. Why is our labor force falling so sharply, and what can we do to amend that? Is it that we register the Venezuelan workers? Is it that we raise retirement age? Something is going on there. And then there's another dynamic at place, and both Dr. Tewari and Mariano Brown mentioned it, which is the behavior of transfers and subsidies. We have an economy, well, I mean, in 2020, the unemployment rate increased, but from about 2006 to about 2019, I'm trying to ignore 2020 because it was an abnormal year, we had very good unemployment rates. And in fact, after 2003 or thereabout, the unemployment rate was low. So the haste of pursuing transfers and subsidies from a labor market perspective and to alleviate poverty perspective, and for those type of agenda, we could remove those. And therefore, the economy with the per capita GDP that we have today could probably manage on a lower level of transfers and subsidies. And I think the report said that, and both Mariano Brown and Dr. Tewari said as much. And this year is the labor force participation rate. And look at the behavior from since about 2005 down. And whilst I didn't cross-reference it in this particular graph against transfers and subsidies, I can tell you I did it elsewhere. And the backward bend, a labor force participation rate that is declining as this, means you have a backward bending labor supply curve. And it's largely linked in terms of the data and in my understanding to transfers and subsidies. So we have to be careful about the labor market implications. The data on table 1, table 2, table 3, table 4, table 5, on page 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, tell a deep story. And what I can tell you is that the real GDP growth performance for 25, 26, 27 goes back to about 1% or thereabout, Denise. And when we get 1% growth or thereabout, our economy ranks, if you look at past data, in the top 30 worst performing in the world. So what we have here now is an opportunity in a sense. So we have announced 5.5 billion growth in nominal GDP. We have an opportunity to look at the structure of our economy, what the IMF data is saying is going to unfold, and put in place measures. Dr. Tewari was very prolific and brilliant as usual, and outlined a series of measures that could reverse those adverse growth performances in 24, 25, 26, and 27. And so the IMF report, again, in line with what Dr. Tewari said, is a sort of eye-opener for the government, in my view. The data is saying, listen, we are at a crossroads, and whilst you might get a little splurge in 22, 23, 24 from the energy sector, we really need now to consolidate and push other parts of the economy. And on that basis, they outlined some recommendations that Mariano Brown detailed. What I say to the young, and most of my graduate class are on, what I say to the young researchers is, yes, read the recommendations, but the meat of the document are in the data table, so you could form your own recommendations. You may, and at the end of the day, you may find yourself not agreeing with the IMF recommendations based upon what the data is saying. So I will stop there and let the discussion continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussain. And we now have 43 people on the chat, which is really good. 43 people are in the room on a Friday afternoon for this very heavy discussion that really speaks to the future of our country and the kinds of action that has to be taken if we are to make a difference, pretty soon. I'll go straight to our audience, and I see Kevin Bagaloo has his hand up. Could you unmute and ask your question?
Good evening, everyone. And as usual, the discussion is always informative and very nice there. I mean, over the years, a couple of these things here, Dr. Hussain himself have been explaining this in detail there. But my question here is, given what both Dr. Tewari and Mr. Brown and they would have said there, right? And it goes like this. Well, in the last discussion which we had, the last one there, Professor Gonzalez and Dr. Ramkissoon, they're probably on this session as well. They agreed and they said that, look, swift action must be taken at some point. So did Dr. Hussain been saying that for quite some time. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that should have been done a very long time ago, regardless of who's in office, who's not in office. Prior to COVID, the economy was on a downward trend there, right? But let's say that action is taken right now, especially where building the non-energy sector is concerned, because y'all are right, we cannot be dependent on the energy sector alone, right? The non-energy sector. If the action is to be taken now, right, and we need that urgent result, which according to Dr. Hussain a while ago, regarding us being in the top 30 worst performing economies and so on there, will we be able to get that result that we're looking for really there? Or as Dr. Tewari said, is it too late?
Dr. Hussain, would you like to answer that question?
Well, what I would say is I agree with the speaker, and this was raised as well in part the last time we had a seminar series. And yes, the time is ripe for structural adjustment. At the IMF report, I am surprised that nobody mentioned it. Did mention that the currency is overvalued about 20%. And one thing that nobody is mentioning is, as we have, based upon the various commentaries, about 100,000 Venezuelans here. So what are these people just to be angling about in the streets and working wherever they can? Is that a factor boom that we could make use of to transform this economy as well? The IMF report mentioned nothing about that, but that is 1/6 of our labor force almost in equivalent. I mean, that's a shocking omission. And that's why I say I generally focus on the numbers in the report, because they would come down for 1 month or thereabouts. How much can they collect in that 1 month? I'm not saying the report is excellent, it's world class, but they miss little things here and there. And I'm sure people like Professor Gonzalez and others would know what I'm talking about. The point is that the time is ripe for structural adjustment. So I agree with Kevin Bagaloo. And a lot of the comments that therefore Dr. Tewari said is of relevance in terms of a response to what he asked. Thanks.
Can I invite Dr. Tewari to comment? And then I would ask Mr. Gonzalez, Dr. Gonzalez to comment. Dr. Tewari, are you with us?
Yeah, I think so. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
I mean,
Just put on your camera. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I heard the question and the comments with it, and I heard Dr. Hussain's response. Well, for one thing, it's never too late. Wherever you find yourself, you have to do something. You have to take action. And maybe we missed as a country many opportunities over several administrations. But the point is, we are here now and we've got to do something. Are there things that we can do now? Yes, there are. I outlined some of them. I don't want to go over those again. But I mean, they are basic stuff. If we dealt with agriculture, we dealt with housing, we dealt with digital transformation and export investment, and the thrust in those together with an increase in import substitution for the inputs into the production process, you would be amazed at what could happen to the country in terms of connectivity and in terms of recovery. But somebody in the government has to understand that and be able to put a team together to get them to make that happen. And this is where I think the missing link is. So it's not too late. There are things that we can do. We cannot do everything, but we can do some things that can make a difference.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tewari. And just after Dr. Gonzalez, I'd like to invite Mariano to come back and give us some of his comments. So, Dr. Gonzalez.
Yes, thank you, Denise. I'd like to take off from where Roger left off, and I think he's quite correct when he spoke about the focus on the medium-term prospects. This is what struck me when I looked at the report, because the forecast seems to be very gloomy. One would think, for instance, that if our reserves, if our exports are growing as a result of the increase in energy prices and so forth, our reserves should increase. But yet still the IMF is forecasting that the reserves will decrease even further. And what they seem to be pointing to here is that the capital flight is the biggest problem that we are having. And that even though exports may increase, capital flight is going to accelerate over the years and it's going to worsen. Now, they haven't proposed how to deal with this, but in my view, they may be suggesting that we have to deal with the foreign exchange problem. We have to deal with the foreign exchange market. And we have to try to take confidence enhancing measures to encourage people to keep their money here. But that to me was the most damning part of the report when I read it, because it means to say that even if your exports are increasing, you're not going to increase your foreign exchange reserves. So I think that focus on the prospects in the next few years, where the non-energy sector is not growing, capital flight is accelerating. I think those are some of the real concerns that we have to concentrate on. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah.
And Mariano.
Well, I think they did. I think I did address the issue with regard to the foreign exchange and some of the issues with regard to confidence. Quite frankly, we haven't addressed it. And the point is to make innovative changes that require a confidence building measures really require you to orient yourself completely differently. And I think that has not happened. The strategy is technically defensive of the foreign exchange position, and by definition, defensive of what we would consider to be the rate of inflation. But I would say that we have some other issues from a fiscal perspective which have been put on the table. One, whilst the Consumer Affairs Division published a note last week indicating that they had managed to mitigate the increase in food prices to 9.7% versus the 43% on the FAO index. The bottom line is that food imports and basic food imports are really subject to lower levels of taxation under normal circumstances in any event. But I think that if we were to look at it literally over a shorter time frame, in other words, not February 2020 to February 2022, but actually to look at it in the context of June 2021 moving forward, I think we'll find a completely different picture. That's the first point. So that the food issue and food and fuel are going to be two issues in terms of the transmission mechanism for what could possibly be a recession, a global recession in this particular instance. We have to take into context the fact, and from a monetary perspective, that one segment of the North American marketplace, mortgage sector, was able to generate a world recession that lasted 4 or 5 years. But here we are in the middle of a situation where we're talking about substantial imports of food and certainly changes in the fuel price variable that are going to have an immediate effect through what you call the price mechanism. I don't think there's any way we could get around that. And that means that we will have to look after our structure of indirect taxation, particularly on food imports, and not just simply through CET. We have some ludicrous examples of certain food items carrying 60% duty. And I'm not talking about anything that is any esoteric item. Is not lobster. Talking about pasta. A simple measure. Pasta really is wheat by another name, and all supposedly done in the interest of protecting certain sections of the community, certain sections of manufacturing. It doesn't make sense. It hasn't made sense. And if we have to talk about manufacturing and the sector that Roger talks about, in the sense that has been showing modest growth, then by definition, they have to be able to competitive. And you can't just simply protect them on the basis of local sales with import duties that, for want of a better term, are irascible. Right? 60% is what you call it, just not defensible from a food perspective to talking about what we're talking about and what we're going to be facing. And most people don't know that, for example, one would presume that most of our wheat imports and so on comes from North America. Well, the answer to that is no, it's blended, right? And some of it does come from other sources like Russia and like Ukraine. They're not small. So there are a number of issues. If we have to talk about really moving the country forward and really addressing some of the issues, of course you have to do it in a sequence fashion, and you can't do everything at once. All right. And so that's, for example, why the fuel adjustment, which was announced today, I think, essentially says that premium carries literally is open market price. The real price is what they're paying, with probably a very minor subsidy. The super a little bit less, and that, but diesel is operating at $4. $4, yes, I think that's the new price, roughly $4, compared to what is the real price, which is probably around $6.50, somewhere thereabouts. So you really still have a subsidy of approximately 50%. And guess where the majority of the fuel is used? Diesel, right? Is it a subsidy to individuals, households? Probably on the transportation side, yes. But most importantly, the majority of our transport fleet, which moves goods around, is all diesel, right? So that's really a subsidy to the business sector, right? And if we were to look at the electricity, which we probably find that we also have a subsidy to our petrochemical sector and electricity rate, which is being used in those particular areas that could pay. So that we're not supporting the diversification effort by in a sense dealing with the comparative pricing issues or forcing efficiencies. So that there is a world of change, I think, in terms of harmonizing policies. The IMF recommendations are very high-level recommendations. Really, you have to work them out in terms of what are the actual detailed implications, sector by sector, fiscal measure by fiscal measure, in terms of what really needs to happen. Why are we defending 60% interest, 60% taxation rate on certain types of food items, or in generally, where the majority of items that we import are really items which are we import for remanufacture for export, quite apart from food. So that there's a key area that we have to focus on, and that is food and substitutability. I'm happy to say that as much as we criticize the local distribution sector, you will find that some of them are using and now have entered into arrangements with farmers for the actual production of food, which is reaching supermarkets. It's nicely packaged, you don't know. And some instances, they do advertise that it's local. But there's some elements there. But we're disorganized at the level of food manufacture, at the level of the size of the lot size, the use of land, how that is going to be sorted out. It's not corporatized in any form or fashion. So we don't have the type of investment that is required. So that there are a number of issues that have to be harmonized from a policy perspective. And I think that is really where we have to get granular and pay attention to what is required. The foreign exchange rate, if your largest item in the middle of the boom, downturn, upturn is the same thing as errors and omissions, it means you have a one-way flow. Right? The only way that you could correct that one-way flow is to allow the exchange rate to float and to float realistically. That will choke off demand. And one of the reasons, or one of the ways that that will be helpful, is that, and you don't need a devaluation to do that, you have a floating rate exchange mechanism. Quite frankly, the value of the TT dollar is floating every day relative to other currencies. Why? Because the US dollar is floating. So even if you like it or you don't like it, the value of the dollar is changing anyhow, right? So there's so much transparency. Was it Say's law? Money is but a veil, right? Money is but a veil. And the bottom line is people will be making those sort of calculations in their head on an ongoing basis. So you've got to defend that sector. And you have, and not so much defend the sector, you've got to defend the exchange, the volume of exchange that we have. And quite frankly, making long-term decisions on the basis of short-term changes in the market. What we have is a short-term change. There's no increase in GDP. We have a price effect. We haven't produced anything more of anything. What we've gotten is better prices for the little that we are producing, right? And at some stage of the game, that is going to go away too. It went away in 2014, it went away in 1986, and it went away in 1967, right? That's the reality, right? And then we have to pay attention to that. So the bottom line is really we are talking about harmonizing it. I agree with Bo when he makes the point that we've defended or gotten away from this all the time. The reality is our decision makers, the Ministry of Trade is far more responsive than the Ministry of Finance. And the reality of our decision makers in terms of power broking is simple. No government has stayed in power if it has either had a devaluation or allowed the exchange rate to move too clearly. None. None. The PNM didn't stay in power. The NER didn't stay in power. The PNM didn't stay in power. And what happened to the UNC? No, they didn't change the rates. So leave them aside. They lost anyhow. Right?
Thank you very much, Mariano.
But that's the issue. No, that wasn't political. That wasn't political shot. Right? That's just humor. Right? Just saying that there was an exception to the rule. Right? But they wonder the benefit of a widening exchange situation. So the bottom line, to my mind, you can't deal with the non-energy sector unless you deal with the exchange rate variable. You can't deal with the issue of business confidence unless you deal with that as well. Right? So that kind of comes up as trumps. Right? It means that in the short run, I have to fix that. And in the second, and following on from that, it means I also have to adjust my fiscal situation. Now, and Robert, the numbers that Roger was using there for transfers and subsidies, we've had a discussion offline about it. And I have queried 3 years because the numbers don't add up in the first instance, and they don't fall in line with my memory of how those monies were spent. So $20 million, $20.7 million, or $20.17 million in 2009 is out to sea. That number is wrong. It's wrong by about $4 billion. So I think they are the critical areas that we have to focus on. You're not going to change the non-energy sector in the short run. Businesses are responding positively. They are doing investments. They are investing in alternative areas. And some of them are not investing in Trinidad. Right? They're investing in their marginal investment increases are taking place in other Caribbean territories, right? Sometimes further afield. This is an opportunity. We have to face some issues. We have to moderate it. And for the first time, I think we need to be honest and tell the country what we need to do. That's the hard part.
Thank you very much, Mariano. And let me hand over to Rebecca, who will wrap up this very exciting session.
I want to take this opportunity to thank each one of our panelists. Indeed, each one of them would have alluded to the importance of ensuring that we have a framework for development, a framework for planning, and executing that in a way that is tractable, executing that in a way that it can be communicated to the people of Trinidad and Tobago so that all of us can be on board. Ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to thank you for your time. We are 2 minutes past our allotted time. So I'm just going to quickly ask our panelists to, in no more than 30 seconds, post their final comments. And I noticed Mr. Brown just put back on his camera. So Mr. Brown, I'm going to ask you to go first, then Dr. Tewari, and finally Dr. Hussain. Mr. Brown, you can unmute your mic. I think he's stuck. Dr. Tewari?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, my first thing is that you can't have all of these problems bunching up at you in the way that we are in the way that they are, and the world basically kind of unraveling before your eyes and realigning, and not do something. Because in your own country, you have the evidence of capital flight, of human capital flight, of an investment strategy shift, of shrinkage of the economy, of sociological unraveling, and a fear of the future and a loss of hope by the population. And if in that circumstance you are paralyzed, the country is going to be finished. So what is required now is intelligent action, and intelligent action can only come if you basically heed expert advice and think those things through. And secondly, if you engage the population in a way to make them understand what needs to be done. And I would say that these are the minimum requirements now.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Tewari. Mr. Brown, are you back with us? May I invite you to just post your final comments in no more than 30 seconds. Mr. Brown, are you hearing us? Perhaps he's lost. Dr. Hossain?
So I would simply say, Rebecca, thank you to you and Denise for excellently hosting this important session. I would invite the participants, I would let them know that we would try to run this every 3 weeks to 1 month. You know, it seems simple, but you have to get people to agree on relevant topics and relevant speakers. And I urge everyone, look at the numbers in the IMF report, so you will get an uncolored picture of what the future looks like. And then you could superimpose on that your opinion and form what you think based upon those numbers are the best reactions now, so that any of the numbers that are adverse, you could sort of prevent them from possibly happening. So I will close there. Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you very much, Denise.
Thank you, Dr. Hussain. To the entire panel, thank you for your time and your expertise, and thank you to my lovely co-host, Ms. Deming, and to you, the audience, for remaining with us. Ladies and gentlemen, do have a pleasant evening and look out for our notices for the next coming sessions. Good night, everyone.